Eric, my friend, welcome to Kazakhstan again.
Thank you. Nice to be back with you.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to it. Actually, when we arranged this, the topics that I had in mind were completely different. As you know, just in the last few weeks, a lot has changed in the Middle East, starting from the 27th of November.
And how? Yes.
Yeah. So, do you want to just give us a brief, your thoughts on what's going on? We can start from there.
Well, everybody's looking at Syria right now. Most Western commentators with jubilation, joy.
Yes.
And there's all kinds of baloney being written about Syria. And then from the Arab point of view, people are being very quiet.
Yes.
Because nobody can think of what the answers are yet in Syria. The big question everybody's asking is how did this happen? Who changed the government in Syria after all these years? And it's a good question. We still don't have all the answers, but we have suspicions.
Yes.
And the suspicions are growing, of course. As I wrote in my last column, the U.S. has been trying to overthrow various governments in Syria since the 1950s.
Yes.
There's a wonderful book on the subject called The Game of Nations by former CIA station chief in Damascus and then again Washington. It's obvious that the U.S. is deeply involved. So is Turkey. Turkish role has still not been revealed so far, but it's very strong. I don't know what role the Israelis played, but it was significant, at least after the fall of the Assad government. The Israelis were immediately went to attack Syria and did a very thorough job of crushing its military forces. So right now, Syria has been knocked out of the military equation. Politically, nothing has replaced the Assad regime yet. No one misses it, except for a small number of Alawis in Syria. But it is no loss to the world, that's for sure. The Russians have suffered a big black eye, I think. But then again, Putin is a ruthless, clever man, and the Russians, I believe, fighting their war in Ukraine now, and their war against the Ukrainians and the Americans in Europe, decided to cut their losses in Syria, which was sort of a sideshow for the Russians, and pulled the plug on the Assad regime. They didn't give it any money. Its money was cut off by the American occupation of a third of Syria. And there you have the current situation. Big muddle.
Let me just take a break here to say, please, please, please do not forget to subscribe. Let's try and take this channel past the 500 subscription mark before the year ends. I really appreciate your help and support. I hope you have a lovely holiday season and a prosperous, healthy, and successful year ahead. Thank you, and let's get back to it. Eric, I think you're absolutely right. I completely agree. I also think, I was just sitting here thinking, what's happening in Syria can't really be seen in isolation. It didn't even start in 2011 with the Arab Spring. In some ways, it started when US invaded Iraq in 2003, and the ripple effects it had in the balance of power in the whole region. I think it's a continuation of that, and I can't see this ending here. I think this is then going to cause more problems and more uncertainties in the area, which is why, as you say, the reaction of the regional powers is correct, bemusement and complete confusion, whereas the reaction of the West, I think is going to be short-lived, this whole jubilance.
Oh, it is for sure, because the U.S. is going to get sucked back in into the Levant and have to deal with a very murky situation that is not well understood in Washington.
Yes. And I also agree. I think if I was a betting man, I would actually bet that Putin is going to come out of this more strengthened in the Middle East, as for Iran as well. I think that this is, in some ways, it kind of liberates them from a lot of kind of baggage that they were carrying.
Well, that's a good point. Certainly the Russians will be happy. As I said, their operation in Syria was a sideshow, though we must remember that Russia's interests in the Levant go back to the 19th century when the Tsars proclaimed Russia the defenders of the Christians of the region. And the Russians had a toe in that boiling cauldron for some time. But now the Russians have to focus on the war in Ukraine and their war against the United States, because in effect, the United States is at war with Russia.
Yes. And I think the Russians realize this. And I think that Russians, Iranians, a lot of regional powers are getting ready for January when Trump takes over to see how they can prepare for that, including Europe. Even Europe's preparing for like effects of Trump.
Well, yes, but we don't know what's going to happen because Trump keeps issuing contradictory messages. And for example, Trump ended the war in Afghanistan with a telephone call. As he said, he cut off the funding for the U.S.-backed forces in Afghanistan, prelude to what happened in Syria. And they collapsed. The longest war in American history just ended, poof, like that. And well done, too. So Trump has to be congratulated for that. On the other hand, Trump is violently pro-Zionist, pro-Israeli. He told them they can have the Golan Heights and more land, and he is an arch-Zionist. The people around him are arch-Zionists as well. So Israel really pulls the strings in Washington, and Trump's received a huge amount of money, $100 million US from pro-Israel sources, from for example, the Las Vegas casino Adelsons. And it's terrible. The American government is for sale. You can just buy it. So is the British government, for that matter, too. So we just don't know what's going to happen yet. There are those on Israel's right wing who are very fanatical, who say that Trump is opening the way for rewriting the whole map of the Middle East and Greater Israel.
Yeah, it's very scary. I think, yes, the Trump that came in and started negotiations with North Korea, the Trump that ended the Afghanistan, apparently started the end of Afghanistan war, tried to pull out of Syria. I think when it comes to Israel, that Trump doesn't exist. This Trump is going to be completely in the pocket of the Zionists. And as you say, I think they're already preparing the groundwork for him.
I'm afraid so. I hope not. I was really delighted to see Trump end the Afghan war. And it showed the Americans how empty their policy and how wrong-headed, that all these brilliant generals who couldn't win this war using B-52s bomb Afghan villages and that. And yet all it took was a telephone call from Trump to cut the money. And that's what was fueling. And then all these so-called Afghan patriots went running back to the U.S. to take shelter there. because that's what the war was about. It was about money.
I'm glad that at least Trump's son-in-law, what's his name?
Kushner.
Yeah, I'm glad he's not playing the same role as he doesn't have the same power in the Middle East as he did before with his kind of interference.
Yeah, but there are other characters who are even less
Yeah,
pleasant than he is. And Kushner's busy trying to do resort developments in Gaza. It's going to turn into a sort of a Miami Beach in
wow,
the
is he still
Middle
doing that?
East,
Yeah.
and in Albania, of all places. So that's his interest. That whole Trump family is all about money.
How do you see what Turkey's role in all of this? Initially, I was really irritated, kind of the backstabbing that um, Erdogan did, but then kind of thinking with a cool head, um, I'm not entirely sure whether he's completely to blame or what, because ultimately, first of all, he's trying to look after Turkey's interest, and Turkey is really, really stressed out about the Kurdish situation in Syria. Secondly, in some ways, Turkey seems to be the only Muslim country in that whole area that isn't completely subservient to USA. They do sometimes, they have their own, they put their foot down, they have their own red lines, whereas other countries just go completely, like Jordan and Egypt. So when Turkey is going to have its own kind of mindset, then you're going to expect them to do sometimes things that other people don't really like.
Well, I can understand that Turks have a very important self interest in the region. They're in the middle of it, or next to it anyway. And Turkey is the only really independent
Yes,
Muslim country in
exactly.
that area. You know, it does what it thinks right. So Erdogan, that's why the Americans tried to overthrow him.
Yeah.
You know, the coup in Turkey a few years ago was backed by the U.S. quietly, and there'll probably be more. The U.S. wants to get rid of Erdogan. He's too independent.
Yes. He was actually supported by the Russians at the time. They kind of helped him ride through that whole kind of um,
Yes,
overthrow.
that's right. Well, the Russians play a very delicate game there. But the Russians don't have that much influence because they don't have the money to back it up, like Washington.
Yes,
They don't,
exactly.
and the Turks are always still dependent on American arms, and the Turkish military's link to the United States is through the arms supply process.
Interestingly, I was listening to a Russian analyst who was talking about how Russia was getting ready now to leave its bases in Syria, but it's actually Turkey and um, this new organization in his what's it called HRS, that it was actually them that actually have convinced Putin and Russia to keep his bases there, don't leave, because I think they can see that things are going to get wild soon, and they need some kind of a balancing um, attempt there.
Well, of course, the Russians have put a lot of money and effort into expanding their influence in Syria, the Levant, and they don't want to give it up, but they have to because they can't afford to do this, and they don't really need those bases. They're small bases.
Yeah,
It's a small air base, small naval base. Uh, it it's nice. Everybody, Western military analysts, got hysterical about them, but in fact, they small base potatoes, those bases, and they're costing a lot of money. So the U.S. is determined to kick the Russians out, no doubt about it. And I think the Russians, if they're wise, will probably pull out.
yeah, because they wouldn't want to get caught up in the mess that's about to start. Potentially, this is going to turn into another Afghanistan.
Another Pakistan, you
Afghanistan.
Afghanistan. Well, it could, because Syria, the war in Syria is not over yet. There's so many factions
That's
there,
it.
and this Tahrir al-Shams people, we don't know who they are. They're former Islamic State. They're former jihadis. We wonder if the Americans are behind them.
Yes.
That's occurred because I was in Afghanistan, as we have said, with the Mujahideen. And these were Islamic wild men, but they were being backed and armed by the United States. So the U.S. is not above dealing with Muslim extremists.
I heard today, again from like a Russian analyst, that in 2012, when Putin initially kind of got involved to settle things, calm things down in Syria, support Bashar al-Assad, he did propose a solution to the West to say that they can help replace Bashar al-Assad and create like a situation where he can leave office in a timely manner. But the West refused. And according to this analyst, the reason is because their main purpose was never to remove Bashar al-Assad, but it was to break Syria down into bits. And that wasn't kind of satisfying that need that they had.
It's possible for sure. You know, the Alawites in Syria is this religious group who are a bit like the Druze in Lebanon, are only 10% of the population
Yeah.
in Syria. So it's never a good idea to back such a small minority group trying to impose its influence. That was especially in the British Empire, as you well know, was to take a dissatisfied minority and give them power and money and establish influence through minorities like India, Bangladesh, etc. So the Russians may not have made the best move here for themselves, been over exuberant.
How do you see the fact that HTS was backed by Turkey, but also Israel and America, and trained by Israel and Turkey, and obviously the background that it has? How is Israel kind of training jihadis in this neighborhood when, for both Israel and Turkey, this could backfire?
Well, they've done it in the past. You know, the Israelis have been supporting the Kurds for over 25 years and arming them against Iraq. So the Israeli support consists of arms, money, and they're for sure giving medical
Yes.
services to the wounded jihadis. We know this for sure. So the Israelis are being very discreet and very cautious about this. But hey, look, it was the Israelis who originally supported the Hamas people. I remember I was there when it was happening, and they allowed them to grow and arm and get money and things like that. And with the Hezbollah was also supported by Israel secretly in the beginning as a way of splitting the PLO. So the Israelis' hands are not clean at all in this situation.
Yeah. Eric, I think it's interesting how, so Israel's got their people in, they've got rid of Bashar al-Assad, they've got the people in that they supported, but they're now going and bombing the hell out of Syria because presumably they're worried that these weapons are going to end up in the hands of the people that they put there, and they don't trust them.
They don't, of course not. They know them well enough and have worked with them long enough not to trust them.
Yeah.
But
the West, sitting far away, can pretend that this is like a completely changed man. He's kind of seen the mistakes of his past ways, and he's reformed. That's all propaganda, but in reality, the Israel who's sitting right there and was supporting them doesn't trust them.
That's the problem. It's Renta Jihadi week
Yeah.
in the Middle East. Wait till Syria starts breaking up into different pieces and clans. And it could be a bigger horror show than Lebanon. I covered the Lebanese Civil War, and it was a nightmare. Nobody knew what was going on. Everybody was killing everybody else. And it was
I remember
unleashed.
that was, yeah, it was a nightmare. Yeah.
Remember, and this could happen just as well in Syria,
Yes.
or as the Israelis are hoping, that Israel could break up into little cantons, little ethnic or religious areas that are busy fighting with each other, and that's the end of Syria. And then the Israelis can move in and start grabbing up pieces of Syria while we're not paying much attention.
Yes. So Giuliani, who is the head of HRT, has said, as Syria is bombing the hell out of Syria, has said that he doesn't have any problems with Israel. His problems are with Iran. But surely at some stage, I think that they're going to end up this honeymoon period that they're going through. I think it's going to be over soon. Apart from anything else, apparently Giuliani comes from Golan Heights himself. So how can he see Israel taking his homeland, his village, everything away, and not do anything? At some stage, they're going to have to turn their attention toward Israel, I think.
A good question. Unless he's a Western agent of influence.
Yeah.
You know, it could from the beginning. The U.S. planted all kinds of agents in the jihadist movement. We saw this from Afghanistan, and he might be working for the other side.
Yes.
Just because he has a beard doesn't mean that he's a real jihadi.
If the situation gets worse, and as Iran and Russia are kind of withdrawing from this whole mess, surely the burden of all of this is going to fall on Turkey because they're sitting right next door. And when things go bad, someone's going to have to play a role to intervene. And Turkey's not going to find all of this like very pleasant.
Well, the Turks used to rule this area. It was part of the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah.
And, Syria was only created by the French as a geographical convenience where they drew the borders after World War I. And so they understand it. And the Turks must be very, very tempted to intervene. But they have a problem with the Kurds, and the Kurdish uprising is starting to get hot again in Turkey. And it's not over. It's, as I said, it's being supported by Israel. The Turks are being condemned in the United States. The incoming Trump administration will be very anti-Turkish because they are Muslims and they're standing up for their own interests. So I see the Turks getting sucked deeper into this mess.
Yes. And I think if it happens that the Syrian borders get redrawn, if Israel comes and takes a bit and Turkey takes a bit and it kind of splits up, I see that because then redrawing of the borders is not just a Syrian thing. There's other countries that similarly are not happy with the borders that they've ended up with, which is how we had the situation with Saddam Hussein and Kuwait to begin with. So that could start a chain of events in the region that might get out of control.
A Libyan diplomat once, the foreign minister of Libya, had told me once, he said, Eric, he said, all the problems in the world are caused by British imperialism. And it's a good point. It's an exaggeration, but it's a good point.
Yeah, I was listening to someone talking about what was happening in Afghanistan, and they were saying they were speaking to an Afghani commander at the time, and they were saying that we're not so upset with the US because US is ignorant and we don't expect much from them. But we're more upset with the British because the British know us, the British know our history, and still this is what they've
Good
done.
point. I concur entirely with that view. The U.S. is completely ignorant about the Middle East. The only people who know anything are the supporters of Israel. They have their own agenda. They're bending U.S. policy now. The British and the French know too, but they don't have the money and the muscle right now to make things happen.
Let me just take a moment's break to introduce our sponsors for today. This episode is proudly being sponsored by the Worldwide Listings Company Limited, or WLC for short. WLC is a e-commerce marketing agency specializing in making brands successful on Amazon. So if you are thinking of starting a new venture, or if you already have a brand and you want to take it to that next level, then get in touch and WLC will be able to help. For transparency purposes, let me also tell you that WLC is actually a company that I founded and am the director of. When you get in touch with WLC, you'll be getting in touch with me and my team, and we look forward to greeting you and seeing how we can help. Thank you, and now let's get back to the episode. So, I think it was someone in the defense in ministry in IDF in Israel who are talking about this risk for Jordan now to get affected by what's going on. They're quite worried that they could if this kind of filters into Jordan with such a huge Palestinian population there, Jordan might become vulnerable.
Well, it has been for a long time, and it will. I remember the Israeli general Ariel Sharon kept saying that he said Jordan is the Palestinian state, the real Palestinian state.
True.
He's right when you say it's almost 60%, maybe more,
True.
Palestinian population. And it's only held there because of the Bedouin army financed by the U.S. Keeps the Palestinians in check on their good behavior. And if there are big changes in the Middle East, Jordan, which is a nice, well-run country, well-run by secret police there, but it functions. It's not a mess like many of the other Arab countries. It will begin suffering the repercussions. I'm surprised there have not been any revolts yet in the Middle East in the last few years against governments.
Yes. When this whole thing started, I think it was a discussion with yourself. I was saying that I'm sure as a result of what's going on in Gaza, there's going to be one or two governments toppling in because they're all quite vulnerable and they're all going in one direction, whereas the people in the streets want them to go into a completely different direction. And there's a lot of pressure brewing up.
Well, we looked at the number one candidates, top leading candidates are Saudi Arabia and Egypt.
Yes.
And where the populations in both countries are very pro-Palestinian, but resent what their governments are doing. But the U.S. has been applying enormous pressure in those countries. The CIA, National Security Agency, FBI, they're all over the place in Egypt and Saudi Arabia to prevent a coup against those governments.
Yeah, talking about Saudi Arabia and Egypt, what do you think about the Muslim Brotherhood strengthening as a result of what's happening? Because first of all, Bashar al-Assad was suppressing them with force. Turkey has been pro-Muslim Brotherhood from start, as has Qatar. Saudi Arabia fears Muslim Brotherhood probably more than anything else. And then Egypt already had kind of a Muslim Brotherhood government that was then toppled by Sisi. So how do you see Muslim Brotherhood's role in what's going on?
I think its influence is going to get stronger, that it will be back. It is, after all, the only opposition group in the Middle East that we're aware of. That's not secret underground.
Yeah.
And it has a long history of trying to bring positive change in the Middle East, even though everybody denounces it as crazy terrorists. On the other hand, when they were briefly in power, we saw first free elections in Egypt's history.
Yeah.
And we saw demands for social change and for better education and human rights, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, it's normal for these organizations, once they get in power, all the promises are forgotten.
Yeah.
And they get just as bad as the old regimes. But definitely, we have to keep an eye on the Brotherhood. It will be back.
How strong is the Muslim Brotherhood in your opinion? Which is the country where they have most presence? Is it Egypt?
Oh, Egypt for sure. And they are strong, even though they've been forced into the underground. Egypt is both the most repressive country in the Arab world.
Yeah.
They're all talking about Assad and how bad he was. Well,
Yeah.
they're worse in Egypt. I know from first-hand experience. Very repressive regime backed by the Americans to the hilt. And the Americans have General or Field Marshal al-Sisi surrounded by circles of security forces to make sure that there's not a coup in Egypt.
Yeah, because that would, if that happens, that's going to be, wow.
Big.
At the moment, also apparently, Iran is trying to prepare for when Trump takes over, to try and mitigate the possibility of US putting more pressure on China so that China stops buying oil from Iran, in which case Iran apparently is preparing logistical supply chain so that oil goes from Iran to Russia and then from Russia to China. How do you see that kind of triangle between Russia, China, and Iran being impacted by Trump?
Well, I think that's a very good analysis, and it will happen. The Trump people, directed by their friends in Israel, will definitely try to impose more economic sanctions on Iran. The American plan, ever since the days of Saddam Hussein, were to make these countries' life so miserable that they're going to overthrow the governments and put in pro-American governments to end the sanctions. This will continue in Iran for sure.
Especially because they see that the sanctions worked in Syria, so it kind of,
Yes.
yeah. But at the same time, how do you see Iran's position in the Middle East after what's happened in Syria? Because yes, now they've lost like a link in the supply chain they had from Iran to Lebanon, but that's kind of happened in the past when Iraq was taken over by the USA. So before they lost the link in Iraq, now they've got that back, and now they've lost Syria. So it's not like a brand new situation in some ways.
I think the supplies question has been overrated. They were running around with Kalashnikovs and the homemade missiles that aren't very effective. It's not like they've got huge armies in the field. The Americans have caused a great deal of damage to Iran. It's been going on 1979. So you can imagine. I remember when the U.S. invaded Iraq, the Iraqi tanks, they were so old and out of date that their gun barrels had been warped and they couldn't fire straight because of American sanctions, which are very punishing, punitive. So it's happened again. These countries have greatly weakened.
When it, when we spoke last time, um, killed, um, Israel had attacked the embassy in Syria, Iranian embassy. Iran was kind of getting ready to retaliate. At that time, I remember you saying that you don't think that Iranian missiles are good enough to um, to take on the Israeli defenses. But now, knowing what we know, what do you think about the capacity of Iranian missile?
Nothing better. The Iranians built a lot of missiles because their air force was so decrepit.
Yeah,
Their planes were falling apart. They couldn't even take off. They were a danger to their pilots. Um, the the Iranians are very weak militarily, very, very weak. Their only strength is if somebody from the West invades Iran on the ground. Then the Iranians, who fought for years in the Iran-Iraq war, will be capable of resisting them with its pasdarans and its infantry forces, and they know how to fight. They have experience, but from the air, they're completely helpless. And the missile forces, as we saw, the when Iran launched a big barrage of missiles against Israel, supposedly, uh, they accomplished nothing, and there were a lot of them were shot down by American aircraft based in Jordan and the Gulf.
also, as we were talking about Russia, that um, effectively Russia is at war with USA, and USA is determined to kind of, if not destroy Russia, at least destroy Putin's government. Um, at some stage, what's going on in the Middle East is somewhat linked at the moment, but at some stage, um, it's going to get even more connected, no? Because as America interferes more and more in Ukrainian war, provides weapons that can strike inside Russia, I don't think Russia is going to retaliate by striking inside Europe and starting a war against NATO. Um, but they're just going to interfere more and more in the Middle East. And it's the same for Iran and other countries, that they are obviously looking to support Russia more and more um, for their own kind of protection. So those two things are going to turn into one event.
Well, I don't think on that big a scale. I think I have a sense that the war in Ukraine is winding down.
Yeah.
The Ukrainians just can't hold off the Russians. You know, I've been a follower of Russian military history for a long time, and the Russians, when they fight wars, they always begin with a big mess and a disaster in the beginning. Everything's falling apart. They go the wrong way, and they don't have the ammo, and whatever the case is. And eventually, the Russians pull up their socks and gradually pull themselves together. And look at World War II, where the Russians were millions of Russians were fell prisoner to the Germans in the beginning of the war. By the end of the war, the Russians had I don't know 200 divisions or something like that. This massive army. I don't know where they got all the men. And they're doing the same thing. They're gradually beefing up their army. And Putin's strategy from day one was not to make this a war, but to make it a police action, as Americans used to call it, and to use military power to impose their policy on Ukraine, kick out its current government, which they regard as an American puppet government. It was put in power by the CIA. And so the Russians could be very patient with this. And they don't need to invade Europe. They've got plenty of land.
Yeah,
They don't know what to do
exactly.
with it.
However, I'm thinking if and when this war ends, Russia is going to have a huge mobilized army, a kind of war industry preparing all these weapons. How do they turn all of that off? And are they going to go looking for another purpose?
I don't think so. Uh, Putin has not shown himself to be an imperialist. Russia may try and reconstitute the old Soviet Union, which Putin himself said was its fall was the greatest tragedy in modern history.
Yeah.
There is some people who believe in that, who follow that line of thought. Uh, Russia was always be menacing because of its size and strength, but I don't see the Red Army pouring into Zurich or
No,
Frankfurt,
I agree.
and most Europeans do not either.
Yeah.
And that's why their defense military budgets are so small. The Trump's horror because Europeans don't want more wars. They just went through the horrors of World War II, and it's hard to get them excited now.
Eric, as we publish this episode, we're going to be kind of with kind of closing up to the end of 2024, getting close to 2025. When you look back at the whole year, a lot was happening. What do you think is going to be the event that has the most long-lasting impact on global politics? Is it the war in Ukraine? Is it what's going on in Israel? Is it how Europe has kind of got deindustrialized during the war of Ukraine? What do you think, or is it what the events that were taking place with BRICS? What do you think is going to be the event that kind of
That's
changes
a
the world?
big question. I could point you to a couple of areas that are of concern to me. Number one is the China's economy looks mighty and huge and everything else, but I've done business for many years in China and traveled through there, and I think the whole thing is a Potemkin village that could collapse overnight. There's no accurate reporting in China. We don't know what's going on. They always give you a bunch of baloney when they're talking to you. China could provoke a worldwide and economic catastrophe. Look at their housing industry right now, as an example. The deindustrialization of Europe. As an investor, I'm very concerned about the fact that some of these great German companies are falling by the wayside. Look at Volkswagen, this great company doing stupid things and now really on the rocks. I'm worried about Volkswagen. I have great respect for the Germans, but they need a new government that's not taking orders from Washington. That represents itself. So the nuclear threats in Europe, in the Ukraine, the chance that we can see chances that Russia may use nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Putin has said they would. They cut back on defense spending. And the minute they did this, the U.S. increased its aggressions against Russia. So the threat of nuclear war is very real and is very high. And it should be the primary mission of the United States and Britain to defuse the situation before it gets worse. There's also other problems. There's always the threat of an Indian-Chinese border war that could produce nuclear problems, nuclear threats. Kashmir, for example, another example. So I think that, and then we've got to stop pumping garbage into the air here on Earth. How we're going to achieve that, I don't know. personally, the Margolis plan is that all countries stop spending money on the military for 1 year and take all the money that they saved and put it into medicine to fight cancer.
That would be amazing. Yes.
for a year. That would be a sensible thing to do. But then we've got all the warmongers in London and Washington, Moscow, Delhi. Still, there's lots of big things to worry about, as always.
Yeah. Very true. I think for now, the border tension between India and China seems to have subsided somewhat, with the BRICS nations kind of trying to resolve issues between each other. But personally speaking, I think you're very right. I think the Kashmir issue, I wouldn't be surprised if that kind of flares up again in 2025. How do you see generally the BRICS doing in the 12 months ahead?
I think they have more and more influence, and they should. I don't believe in a unipolar world where the United States pulls all the strings of world affairs. And it's good. We need some balance. I think it was the collapse of the Soviet Union, to paraphrase President Putin, was a disaster, but it was a disaster because it unleashed the United States to do things as an imperial power that it wouldn't have done normally if the Soviet Union had been there. And we need some more counterforce now to achieve balance and to make people understand that peace as a policy is our primary interest.
Very true. I've heard that one of the things that Russia is proposing for the BRICS nations is that any country who's part of the BRICS cannot apply sanctions on another BRIC nation that has been instigated by a third country. And I think if they can do that, I think that would be amazing.
I think it's a hell of a good idea too. I hope they do.
Yeah, I think that would be a game changer. I think a lot of smaller countries are worried if they kind of step in that direction, how the US is going to react. But if China, Russia, India, they can provide that kind of support, and smaller countries can join them, I think it's going to be to the benefit of everyone, especially the smaller countries.
Agree entirely.
Brilliant. Eric, thank you so much. I wish you a very lovely Christmas, New Year, and let's get together again sometime beginning of 2025.
Hopefully, we can, inshallah. Anyway, thank you. Happy holidays to you.
Thank you so much. Inshallah. Thank you, Eric.
Bye-bye.
Bye.